Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to be uncovering the invisible scaffolding that is literally holding up the modern American economy. It's really easy to just assume the strength of the US dollar is some kind of natural force of economic gravity, right? Like it's just always been that way. But the truth is actually much more intentional. It traces all the way back to a highly secretive agreement made half a century ago. So let's dive right in and explore this brilliant geopolitical maneuver that completely reshaped global finance as we know it. All right, part one, running out of trust and the 1971 crisis. So to really understand why this deal was even necessary in the first place, we have to ask ourselves, what actually happens when a global superpower suddenly looks into its wallet and realizes the trust backing its currency is just evaporating? Up until 1971, the entire global financial system operated on a very specific promise, but the US was seriously struggling to keep it. We were spending heavily, printing money like crazy, and honestly, the rest of the world was catching on. And that led to a massive drain on confidence. It's a crazy contrast when you really think about it. Before 1971, global currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged directly to physical gold. You could, theoretically, take your paper dollars and trade them in for actual physical gold bullion. It was literally as good as gold. But as the US kept printing more and more money, foreign nations got nervous. They rushed to exchange their dollars, which absolutely drained US gold reserves. So to stop the bleeding, the government just completely severed the tie. Literally overnight, the dollar went from being backed by physical gold to being backed by absolutely nothing. Zero. And trust? Well, it was running out fast. Which brings us to part two, the secret desert deal, or as some call it, Kissinger's masterstroke. Okay, so to save the whole economy from going into a complete freefall, a new foundation had to be built, and it had to be built quietly. Following that gold shock in '71, things actually got worse with a massive global oil crisis in 1973. Energy prices skyrocketed, and the US economy was really reeling. Enter Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. In 1974, he orchestrated this absolute masterstroke of a deal out in the Saudi desert. The terms were surprisingly simple. The United States would provide military protection and hardware to Saudi Arabia, and in exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil sales exclusively in US dollars. This wasn't just a trade agreement. This was a fundamental rewiring of the entire global economy. Let's move into part three, the invisible scaffolding holding up the economy. Now, this specific 1974 deal birthed what we now call the petrodollar. And this is that hidden structural framework I mentioned earlier, the scaffolding holding up the towering structure of global economics. To be clear, a petrodollar isn't some special, shiny new type of currency. It's just a regular, everyday US dollar that happens to be used to purchase oil. But here's the genius of it. Because oil is the lifeblood of the modern industrial world, suddenly every single nation on Earth literally needed to hold US dollars just to keep their lights on. By linking the dollar to oil, the US effectively replaced gold with black gold, guaranteeing non-stop global demand for its currency. All right, part four. Petrodollar recycling explained. Let's follow the money. This is where it gets really brilliant. It's a four-step loop known as petrodollar recycling, and it basically ensures that money flows directly from oil sales right back to the US government. Just think about how perfectly this loop operates. Step one, because of that 1974 deal, a country like Japan or Germany has to buy US dollars first before they can even buy Saudi oil. Step two, Saudi Arabia and other oil exporters become incredibly wealthy, right? They just accumulate these massive mountains of US dollars. Step three, they don't just leave billions sitting in a vault. They invest them into the safest asset on earth, United States Treasury bonds, which means they are essentially loaning the money back to the US government. And finally, step four, the US government uses this loaned money to finance its own spending. The loop is totally complete, and it is unbelievably powerful. And that brings us to part five, the exorbitant privilege in funding the empire. So what does this all mean for America? Well, this recycling mechanism grants the United States an unparalleled, almost unfair advantage, what economists actually call an exorbitant privilege. It allows America to fund massive military operations and government programs while basically pushing its inflation outward onto everyone else. Because the entire world is constantly forced to buy and hold US dollars for their energy needs, the United States can print vast amounts of money without experiencing the crippling hyperinflation that would completely destroy other countries. That global, insatiable demand for the petrodollar essentially acts like a sponge, absorbing the impact.
The heavy weight of inflation gets deflected outward, subtly subsidizing the US empire through this continuous, endless cycle of recycling.
But, as we know, things change. Part 6. The End of an Empire. The EV Shift. Every system, no matter how invisible or how powerful, has a breaking point. And our sources point out a really profound warning. If the world stops using the dollar for oil, the exorbitant privilege ends. It's that simple. If de-dollarization actually occurs, meaning if nations decide to start trading oil in their own local currencies or in gold, that massive built-in global demand for the US dollar just plummets. The recycling loop shatters. The US would suddenly find it incredibly expensive to borrow money, and all that deflected inflation, it could come rushing right back home, completely dismantling this invisible scaffolding we've been talking about. Which brings us to the technological elephant in the room. I want to leave you with this final, really fascinating question to think about. Is the real threat to this whole system not a foreign army, but a battery-powered car? Think about it. Will the upcoming aggressive shift toward electric vehicles in 2025 and beyond be the catalyst that finally breaks this decades-old geopolitical trust? Because if the world actually transitions away from oil and toward electric energy, the foundational need for the petrodollar weakens immensely. If oil is no longer the undisputed king of global energy, the currency tied to it loses its exorbitant privilege. It is a massive question, and it's for sure going to define the very next chapter of global economics. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it brought some real clarity to the invisible forces that are actively shaping our world.